'Twas a sunny afternoon, and the streets were busy with people rushing to their destinations. Among the traffic, a black sedan pulled over to the side of the road. Inside the car was Alana Royce, a calm and poised woman in her late 30s. She had just finished a long day and was on her way home. As she signaled to turn, she noticed the flashing lights of a police car in her rearview mirror. Puzzled, she pulled over. The officer, a tall man with a stern face, approached her window briskly. "License and registration," he demanded without a greeting. Alana nodded politely and reached for her documents. "Of course, officer. May I know why I was pulled over?" she asked in a calm tone. The officer ignored her question, tapping his fingers impatiently on her window. As she handed him her papers, he glanced at them quickly but didn't seem to care about her politeness or her question. "You made an illegal turn," he said curtly. Alana frowned slightly, her mind running through her recent actions. She was sure she had signaled properly and obeyed the rules. "I don't believe I made an illegal turn, officer. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." Her response seemed to irritate. The next morning, Alana Royce sat at her dining table, sipping her coffee. The sunlight streamed through the windows, but her mind was elsewhere. The previous day's incident replayed in her head like a broken record. She wasn't angry. She rarely let emotions control her. Instead, she felt a sense of responsibility. Something had to be done, not just for herself, but for others who might face the same situation. Alana glanced at her phone. It had been buzzing with notifications since last night. Curious, she opened one of the messages from a close friend. "Have you seen this?" The message read, followed by a link. Clicking on it, Alana was greeted with a video of her. It was the encounter with the officer, captured by a bystander and shared on social media. The clip had already been viewed thousands of times, and the comment section was flooded with outrage. Why didn't she fight back? One commenter wrote, "This is unacceptable." Another chimed in, "She looks familiar. Who is she?" Someone else added. Alana leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. The video wasn't just a recording of an incident, it was a spark. People were talking, questioning, and demanding answers. Meanwhile, across town, the officer from the incident sat at his desk at the police station. He scrolled through his own phone, shaking his head as he came across the same video. "Just another internet drama," he muttered to himself. But his colleagues weren't so dismissive. Whispers filled the station as officers exchanged glances, some nodding toward him. A few dared to approach, asking questions. "Did you really spit on her?" one asked cautiously. The officer waved him off. "It's blown out of proportion. She was being difficult." End of story. Despite his casual attitude, unease began to creep in. The whispers didn't stop, and he noticed his superiors were paying closer attention to him than usual. Back at her home, Alana received a call. It was from her assistant, Alina. "Judge Royce, I think it's time we act," Alina said firmly. Alana nodded, even though Alina couldn't see her. "You're right. Let's make sure this is handled the right way." Her title, Judge Royce, wasn't just a job, it was a role she carried with integrity. As a judge, Alana believed in justice, fairness, and accountability. The officer's behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was an abuse of power. By the afternoon, Alana had made a few important phone calls. One was to her legal team, and another was to the police department. She didn't reveal her identity right away, choosing instead to follow the official complaint process. News outlets began picking up the story. Headlines flashed across screens. Viral video sparks outrage. Woman faces police misconduct. Who is the calm woman in the video? Internet demands justice. The buzz grew louder, and the officer's name started to circulate. His casual dismissal of the situation began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. As the day turned to evening, Alana sat at her desk, reviewing her plans. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was seeking change. "I won't let this slide," she said to herself, determination lighting up her eyes. Little did the officer know, The woman he had underestimated was about to change everything. By the next morning, the video had exploded online. News outlets, influencers, and everyday people were sharing it with hashtags like #JusticeForAlana and #AccountabilityNow. The clip had been viewed millions of times, and Alana Royce, though unnamed in the video, was becoming the face of the movement. Alana sat in her living room, scrolling through the posts. She saw the anger, the support, and the questions pouring in. People wanted to know more about the calm, composed woman who had endured such disrespect. Meanwhile, the police station was in chaos. Reporters were calling, demanding statements. Protesters had gathered outside, holding signs and chanting for justice. The officer from the video, Officer Greg Walters, was feeling the pressure. "What's the big deal?" he grumbled to a colleague. "It's just another viral video. It'll blow over in a few days." But his superior, Captain Harris, wasn't so sure. He summoned Officer Walters to his office, the tension in the air palpable. "Greg, this is serious," Captain Harris said, his tone firm. "This video is everywhere. People are calling for your resignation. What were you thinking?" Walters shrugged. "She was being difficult. I was just doing my job." "Doing your job?" Harris's voice rose slightly. "Spitting on someone isn't part of the job. Do you realize how bad this makes all of us look?" Walters shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't expected this much backlash. In his mind, it was just another routine stop that had gone slightly sideways. He didn't understand why people were so upset. Back at her home, Alana received a phone call from a local journalist. "Ms. Royce, people are calling you a hero. Would you like to share your side of the story?" the reporter asked. Alana hesitated. She wasn't looking for fame or attention, but she knew the power of the moment. "Thank you for reaching out," she replied. "I'm not interested in being the hero. What I want is accountability and change." The journalist's story hit the news that evening, and for the first time, Alana's name was revealed. Judge Alana Royce. The revelation sent shockwaves through the public. "A judge," one news anchor exclaimed during a broadcast. The officer didn't even know he was dealing with a judge. The story only grew from there. People were amazed at Alana's restraint during the incident, especially given her position of power. Many pointed out that her calm response had likely saved her from an even worse situation. At the police station, the atmosphere grew more tense. Officer Walters began to realize the gravity of his actions. His fellow officers were avoiding him, and his name was being mentioned in headlines for all the wrong reasons. That evening, Alana sat with her assistant Elena, reviewing the flood of emails and messages she had received. Many were from strangers offering support, while others shared their own stories of unfair treatment. "This isn't just about me," Alana said, her voice steady. "This is about something much bigger. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." Elena nodded. "You're right, Judge Royce. And it's clear people are ready to listen." As the sun set, Alana knew the real work was just beginning. The video was more than a spark, it was a fire, and she was ready to ensure it burned brightly for change. The following days were a whirlwind for Alana Royce. The world now knew her name, and her inbox was filled with messages, both supportive and questioning. The video had turned into a national discussion, with people from all walks of life expressing their opinions. Alana wasn't used to the spotlight, but she knew this was no ordinary situation. She had a duty to speak out, to make sure the officer's actions didn't go unchallenged. But while the world was focusing on the incident, the officer, Greg Walters, was still refusing to believe the situation was as serious as it seemed. He kept telling himself it would all blow over. After all, he was just doing his job, or so he believed. One afternoon, Walters was called into his superior's office. Captain Harris stood by the window, staring out at the protesters gathered outside the police station. The tension in the room was palpable. "Sit down, Greg," Harris said without turning around. Walters obeyed, sinking into the chair opposite his boss. He still couldn't fully understand what had happened. Why was everyone so upset? Why were they acting like he had done something wrong? "Have you seen the latest news?" Captain Harris asked, his voice stern. Walters nodded. "Yeah, it's all over the place. But I don't see what the big deal is. People are just making a fuss." Harris turned to face him, his expression hard. "That's the problem, Greg. You don't see it. You don't understand what you've done." Before Walters could respond, a knock on the door interrupted the conversation. A young officer stepped inside, holding a folder. "Sir, there's something you need to see," the officer said. Harris motioned for the officer to place the folder on his desk. As he opened it, a photo of Alana Royce's judicial credentials appeared on the first page. "Who is this?" Harris asked, his voice growing more serious. The officer cleared his throat. "That's Judge Alana Royce. She's one of the top judges in the state." Walters blinked in confusion. "Wait, you mean? She was the woman I stopped? She's a judge?" Harris nodded slowly. "Yes, Greg. And you didn't just spit on a random woman. You disrespected someone who has the power to bring real consequences." Walters sat back in his chair stunned. He had no idea the woman he'd treated with such disregard was a judge. He had underestimated her, thinking she was just another person he could push around. Meanwhile, Alana sat in her office, preparing for the next steps. Her legal team had been working tirelessly to ensure the officer's actions wouldn't be swept under the rug. She had filed an official complaint with the police department, detailing everything that had happened, and now the department had no choice but to respond. Alana didn't care about personal revenge. She wasn't seeking to ruin anyone's life, but she did want to make sure that no one else would have to face the same treatment. As she looked over the legal documents, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her assistant, Alina. "It's time," the message read. Alana took a deep breath. The officer had no idea what he was about to face. She wasn't just a random woman. She was a judge, and she would make sure her voice was heard. The next day, the police department was notified of a formal disciplinary hearing, and the officer, still unaware of the true weight of his actions, was about to learn just how serious the situation was. The day of the disciplinary hearing arrived, and the atmosphere in the police department was tense. Officer Greg Walters was called into a small conference room, where a panel of senior officers and legal experts sat waiting. It wasn't a typical meeting. The usual casual chats and small talk were absent. Today, there was a sense of seriousness in the air, and Walters couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. He walked in, his usual confidence now replaced with a quiet unease. He hadn't expected to be in this position, not after all these years on the force. He was a good officer, he thought, and he had always followed the rules. So why was everyone making such a big deal out of one minor mistake? As he sat down, the panel's leader, Captain Harris, looked at him with a stern gaze. "Greg, we're here today to discuss your actions during the traffic stop last week. You've been accused of misconduct and assault." Walter's mind raced. "I didn't assault anyone. I just had to deal with a difficult situation," he said, trying to defend himself. Captain Harris raised an eyebrow. "A difficult situation. Let's be clear. We've all seen the video. You spat on a woman, Greg. A woman who wasn't just anyone. She's Judge Alana Royce, one of the top judges in the state. Did you know that?" Walters froze, his face turning pale. He had no idea. The shock of hearing her name hit him hard. The calm woman he had disrespected so easily was a judge. "No, I didn't know," Walters muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps you should have," Captain Harris continued, his tone harsh. "Because now you've not only embarrassed yourself, but also brought shame to this entire department. And we are taking this very seriously." As the hearing continued, Walters was questioned about his behavior. He tried to explain himself, but it was clear that his actions couldn't be justified. The evidence was overwhelming. There was the video, witness testimonies, and now the added weight of Alana Royce's position. Back in her office, Judge Royce was reviewing the details of the case. She was calm, focused, and determined to see that justice was done. Alana had known that something had to change, but seeing how the police department was handling it only reinforced her belief that accountability was necessary. She wasn't going to let the officer's actions go unnoticed, no matter who he was. As she sat at her desk, Alana's phone rang. It was her assistant, Alina. "The hearing has started," Alina said. "Are you watching?" Alana nodded. "I'm not watching, but I'm following it closely. It's important to stay focused." The conversation with Alina was brief, but it reminded Alana of the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about setting a precedent. She wanted to make sure that everyone, no matter their job or position, was held to the same standard. Back at the police department, the hearing was nearing its end. Walters felt more and more isolated with each passing minute. The other officers in the room were not siding with him. They were looking at the evidence, at the video, and at the judge's calm yet powerful statement. And they knew that what he had done was unacceptable. Captain Harris turned to Walters one last time. "We will be making a decision about your future with the department. But one thing is clear. You've made a serious mistake, and now we have to deal with the consequences." Walters sat silently, realizing that his life had just taken a very unexpected turn. He had no idea the woman he had underestimated was about to change everything. The news of the disciplinary hearing spread quickly, but the real storm was yet to come. As the story of Officer Greg Walters' misconduct continued to make headlines, the public reaction grew stronger. People were outraged. Videos of the incident circulated widely, sparking conversations across social media platforms. Everyone seemed to have an opinion on the situation. In the days following the hearing, Alana Royce's name was everywhere. People admired her calmness in the face of disrespect. She had become a symbol of dignity, strength, and resilience. Even though she had remained composed during the traffic stop, it was clear that she was now using her platform to push for real change. Social media was flooded with posts, hashtags like #JusticeForAlana and #RespectTheLaw trending worldwide. Supporters shared their own stories of facing similar disrespect, while others praised Alana for standing up to a powerful institution. People were talking about accountability in law enforcement, and Alana had become a voice for the voiceless. The news outlets were buzzing with coverage. "A judge in the spotlight. Alana Royce demands accountability after officer's misconduct," one headline read. Another news story focused on the growing number of protests in support of Alana. The public was watching closely, and their support was overwhelming. But not everyone was happy with the attention Alana was receiving. The police department, which had already been dealing with the fallout from the incident, now found itself under even more pressure. Captain Harris could feel the weight of the public's anger. The department's reputation was on the line, and they had no choice but to act. They couldn't afford to let this situation slip under the radar. Inside the department, Walters was feeling the full force of the storm he had unwittingly unleashed. His colleagues, once friendly and supportive, now avoided him. He knew that things were no longer the same. The shame of his actions was sinking in, and he realized that his career was on the line. Despite the pressure, Walters tried to defend himself in private conversations with other officers. "I didn't mean to make such a big deal out of it," he said, sounding defensive. "She was being difficult. I didn't know she was a judge." But no one seemed to be on his side anymore. His excuses fell on deaf ears. The video was everywhere, and the public was demanding justice. It was clear to everyone that the officer had crossed a line, and the support for Alana Royce only grew stronger. Meanwhile, Alana remained focused on the bigger picture. She was grateful for the support, but she wasn't satisfied. The viral attention was important, but it wasn't enough. She knew that true change would require more than just public outrage. It would require real action. "I'm not fighting for revenge," Alana said to her assistant, Alina, one afternoon. "I'm fighting for the future. We can't let this happen again." She knew that the moment had come to ensure that this situation wasn't just a passing headline. She would work with community leaders, legal experts, and activists to push for real police reforms. Her voice had been heard, but she wouldn't stop until it brought about lasting change. The stage was set. The story had gone beyond just one officer's mistake. It had become a movement. And Alana Royce was at the forefront, determined to make sure the world didn't forget what had happened. The pressure was mounting for Officer Greg Walters. Public opinion was against him, and the police department could no longer ignore the widespread outcry. The disciplinary hearing had ended, but the real work was just beginning. Walters knew that his career was hanging by a thread. Even some of his fellow officers were starting to question his actions. Alana Royce, on the other hand, was determined to make sure this didn't end with just a few headlines. She wasn't seeking revenge, but she wanted to make sure there were real consequences. She had spent years in the courtroom, fighting for justice, and this situation was no different. Accountability was the key, and she was ready to make sure the officer and the system were held accountable. It didn't take long for the police department to announce that they would be taking action. Walters was placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation continued. The department also announced that they would be reviewing their procedures on how officers should handle situations like the one with Alana. For Alana, this was a step in the right direction, but she knew that words alone wouldn't bring about the lasting change she wanted. She called a meeting with her legal team and a few trusted community leaders to discuss the next steps. It was time to make sure the conversation didn't end with the officer's suspension. "There has to be more to this," Alana said, her voice calm but firm. "We can't just stop here. We need a real change, something that makes sure no one else experiences what I did. We need better training for the officers, more oversight, and stronger community relationships." Her words were met with nods of agreement from everyone in the room. They all knew that this wasn't just about one officer. It was about creating a system where every person, regardless of race, gender, or position, could expect to be treated with respect. Together, they began working on a proposal for police reform. It would include mandatory de-escalation training for all officers, improved community outreach programs, and the creation of an independent oversight committee to investigate complaints of police misconduct. Meanwhile, Officer Walters was facing the consequences of his actions. The internal investigation found that his behavior had violated several department policies. He was officially reprimanded and placed under strict probation. His record would forever reflect the incident, and any further missteps would result in immediate termination. As the days passed, Walters began to realize the full extent of his mistake. He had underestimated the woman he had mistreated. She wasn't just a judge. She was a symbol of the change the world needed. But the impact of Alana's actions went far beyond the police department. Across the country, other cities started to look at their own police procedures, and many began considering similar reforms. Alana's story was no longer just about one incident. It had become a call for action, a moment for people to stand up and demand a system that treated everyone equally. Alana continued to speak out, not out of anger, but out of a deep belief in fairness. Her calm determination had made waves, and now, those waves were starting to move toward lasting change. She had started a conversation, and she wasn't going to stop until it led to real results. For Alana, it wasn't just about what happened on the street that day. It was about ensuring that everyone could feel safe, respected, and heard, no matter who they were. Months had passed since the incident, and Alana Royce could finally take a deep breath. The whirlwind of media attention, the protests, and the discussions about police reform were beginning to settle, but the effects of what had happened would last far longer. Her efforts had sparked change, and that was something she could be proud of. But more importantly, Alana knew that this was just the beginning. One afternoon, Alana stood by her office window, watching the hustle and bustle of the city below. Her phone buzzed on her desk, and she picked it up. It was a message from Alina, her trusted assistant, who had been by her side throughout the entire journey. "It's done," the message read. "The reform bill has passed." A smile crept onto Alana's face. This was the moment she had worked so hard for. The bill was the result of months of tireless efforts, meetings with lawmakers, collaborating with activists, and pushing for policies that would hold police officers accountable for their actions. It was a significant victory, not just for Alana, but for everyone who had been fighting for fairness and justice. Alana had always known that real change didn't happen overnight. It took hard work, persistence, and the courage to stand up for what was right. And though the process had been difficult, she had never backed down. She wasn't just fighting for herself or her own dignity. She was fighting for the countless others who had faced the same injustices. The reform bill required police officers to undergo comprehensive training on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and how to interact with communities in a respectful manner. It also created a new independent oversight committee that would ensure any complaints about police misconduct would be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. Alana knew these changes wouldn't solve every problem, but they were an important step toward a more just and accountable system. As the news of the reform bill's passage spread, Alana received messages of congratulations from across the country. People thanked her for her courage, for speaking out when so many would have stayed silent. She had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that one person could make a difference. But Alana knew that the real work was far from over. The world had changed, but there was still much to be done. She would continue to fight for fairness, not just in the courtroom, but in every corner of society. The road to justice was long, and she was ready to walk it. In the weeks that followed, Officer Greg Walters resigned from the police force. His career, once filled with promise, was now over. He had learned the hard way that respect for others was not something that could be taken lightly. His actions had consequences, and Alana's unwavering pursuit of accountability had ensured that. But for Alana, it wasn't about the officer's resignation or his punishment. It was about the bigger picture, the reforms that were now in place, the new awareness that had been raised, and the countless lives that would be touched by these changes. As Alana sat back in her chair, looking out at the city skyline, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She had done what she set out to do. Her legacy was not just about what happened to her that day, but about the lasting change she had helped create. And with that, she knew she could finally rest, knowing that the fight for justice, fairness, and equality would continue, and that her voice had been a catalyst for something much bigger than herself. 'Twas a sunny afternoon, and the streets were busy with people rushing to their destinations. Among the traffic, a black sedan pulled over to the side of the road. Inside the car was Alana Royce, a calm and poised woman in her late 30s. She had just finished a long day and was on her way home. As she signaled to turn, she noticed the flashing lights of a police car in her rearview mirror. Puzzled, she pulled over. The officer, a tall man with a stern face, approached her window briskly. "License and registration," he demanded without a greeting. Alana nodded politely and reached for her documents. "Of course, officer. May I know why I was pulled over?" she asked in a calm tone. The officer ignored her question, tapping his fingers impatiently on her window. As she handed him her papers, he glanced at them quickly but didn't seem to care about her politeness or her question. "You made an illegal turn," he said curtly. Alana frowned slightly, her mind running through her recent actions. She was sure she had signaled properly and obeyed the rules. "I don't believe I made an illegal turn, officer. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." Her response seemed to irritate